My children made me feel like a burden long before I had the courage to admit that the word had started living inside my chest. My name is Margaret Ellis. I am 82 years old and I live alone in a small flat in a quiet suburb outside Manchester. In the mornings, I hear the bin lorry before I see the daylight properly. I hear school children walking past the pavement, cars starting, doors closing, people with places to be. For most of my life, I was the person other people came to when they needed something. A meal, a lift, a clean shirt, someone to watch the children, someone to answer the phone at midnight and say, "It's all right, love, I'm here." I built my whole life around being useful, and then, little by little, I began to understand that usefulness is a dangerous place to build your worth. If you have ever felt invisible inside your own family, stay with me and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from, because sometimes a stranger understands a silence your own family never noticed. I worked part-time in a bakery for nearly 30 years. I can still remember the smell of warm bread on winter mornings, flour under my fingernails, the glass counter fogging up slightly when the first customers came in from the cold. I used to leave before sunrise, work my shift, come home, put a wash on, make tea, help with homework, and somehow still find the strength to smile when the children needed me. My husband, Arthur, was a quiet man, good, gentle, proud in that old-fashioned way that made him pretend he was fine even when he wasn't. When he became ill, slowly at first and then all at once, I learned another kind of work. Tablets lined up beside the kettle, appointments written on the calendar, clean pyjamas warming on the radiator, nights spent listening to his breathing, afraid of what silence might mean. My children, David and Helen, had their own homes by then. I told them not to worry. I told everyone not to worry. That was what I did. I made other people's lives lighter, even when mine was bending under the weight. After Arthur died, the house felt too full and too empty at the same time. It had 3 bedrooms, a little front garden with roses he used to prune badly, and a kitchen table marked with years of homework, bills, birthday cakes and elbows. David said it was too much for me. Helen said the heating bills would only get worse. They were not wrong. The stairs had become harder, and the roof did need attention. But it still hurt when they spoke about the house as if it were only bricks, maintenance and money. To me, it was the place where my life had happened. Still, I agreed. I sold it because they seemed so sure, and because part of me wanted to be the kind of mother who made things easier, even after everything had already been taken from her. Some of the money helped Helen renovate her kitchen. Some went to David when he was having financial trouble he never fully explained. I moved into this flat with beige carpets, a narrow balcony, and walls that did not know my name. At first, they came often. Helen would arrive with the children and a bag of shopping she claimed she had picked up by accident. David would pop in after work, stand in the doorway with his coat still on, and ask if I needed anything done. My grandchildren ran through the flat as if it had always been part of their world. They opened cupboards, complained there were no biscuits they liked, left trainers in the hallway. I pretended to fuss, but secretly I loved the mess. It made the flat feel less like a place I had been put, and more like a home that still belonged to the family. On Sundays, I cooked roast chicken, potatoes, carrots, gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. I set the table carefully, using the old serving dish from the house. When they sat around it, I could almost convince myself that nothing important had been lost. But things changed in a way that was hard to accuse anyone of. Helen's visits became shorter. David's calls became practical. "You all right, Mum?" he would ask, but in a tone that already hoped the answer was yes. The grandchildren grew taller and quieter. They stopped asking for stories and started asking for the Wi-Fi password. If I sent a message, Helen might answer hours later with, "Sorry, manic day." David would call back 2 days after I had rung and say, "Was it urgent?" I began to say no, even when it had felt urgent at the time. I began to make my needs smaller before anyone else had the chance to do it for me. The first time I felt embarrassed at my own dinner table, I had made shepherd's pie because it used to be David's favourite. He arrived with his wife and the children, and Helen came later, apologising before she even took off her coat. Everyone seemed tired. I tried to keep the evening warm. While I was putting plates down, I started telling a story about David at school. The time he had come home with one shoe because he had traded the other for a packet of football stickers. My grandson smiled at first. Then Helen sighed softly and said, "Mum, you've told that one loads of times." She did not mean to hurt me, I know that, but the story stopped in my mouth. David glanced at his phone. Someone asked about petrol prices. The conversation moved on without waiting for me. I stood there with the serving spoon in my hand, feeling suddenly like an old photograph everyone had seen too many times. After that, I started listening to myself differently. I noticed how often I began sentences with an apology. "Sorry to bother you." "Sorry, I know you're busy." "Sorry, could you just help me with the telly?" When the remote stopped working properly and I could not get the channels back, I rang David. He came round after work, but he sighed while kneeling in front of the television. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough. "Mum, you've pressed something again," he said, smiling as if it were funny. "You old lot and technology." I laughed because he expected me to, but when he left, I sat with the remote in my lap and stared at the screen. The programs were back. Something else was not. There were other little things. Helen started speaking to me in a careful voice, the sort of voice I had heard nurses use in waiting rooms when they were trying to be kind to confused patients. She would say, "Now, Mum, did you remember to take your tablets?" even though I had never missed them. David would tell me not to carry shopping upstairs, then sound irritated when I asked if he could help. At family gatherings, plans were discussed around me. Who could drive where? Who was hosting Christmas? Which school event they had to attend? What weekend they might go away? Sometimes I would only learn about things after they had happened. "Oh, we all went over to Helen's on Saturday," David would say, as if it were nothing. And I would nod, as if I had not spent Saturday afternoon drinking tea beside a silent phone. One afternoon I went to the supermarket and bought more than I should have. Milk, potatoes, washing powder, tins of soup, a small bunch of daffodils because they were by the till and I wanted something bright. Halfway back, the bag with the tins cut into my fingers. I had to stop by a low wall and put everything down. A man walking his dog asked if I was all right. I said yes too quickly. He carried one bag to the entrance of my building, and I thanked him until he looked almost embarrassed. When I got upstairs, I left the shopping on the kitchen floor and sat down, still wearing my coat. I wanted to call David and say, "It is getting harder." Not because I wanted pity, I just wanted my son to know, but I could already hear the answer. "Mum, you should get it delivered," or "Why didn't you ask earlier?" So I did not call. I put the daffodils in a glass jar and pretended that was enough company for the afternoon. The humiliation never arrived as one dramatic moment. It gathered like dust in corners. A look exchanged between my children when I forgot a name. A joke about stubborn old people when I said I could manage. A pause before answering me, as though they were deciding how much truth I could handle. I became careful in rooms where I had once been natural. I stopped telling long stories. I stopped asking whether anyone wanted to come for Sunday lunch, unless I was prepared for the answer to be no. I stopped saying when I felt lonely, because loneliness in an old woman makes people uncomfortable. They either rush to fix it, or step away from it. Very few simply sit beside it. Then came the afternoon I overheard Helen in the kitchen. I was at her house for tea. She had invited me, though later I wondered whether it had been more out of guilt than desire. The children were upstairs. David had come over as well, and I was in the hallway taking off my coat. I moved slowly because the buttons had become fiddly. The kitchen door was not closed properly. I heard Helen whisper, "Maybe it's time we start thinking about a proper place for Mum before things get harder." David said something I could not catch. Then Helen added, "I just don't want everything to become a crisis." The words were not cruel. That was the worst of it. They were practical, tidy, sensible. A proper place, before things get harder. I stood in that hallway with my coat half off and felt as if they had already begun moving me somewhere in their minds. I went into the kitchen anyway. Helen smiled too brightly and asked if I wanted tea. David looked at me for a second too long, perhaps wondering what I had heard. I said yes. We sat at the table. The kettle clicked. Someone put biscuits on a plate. Nobody mentioned what had just been said, but I could feel it in the room, placed carefully between us, like paperwork waiting to be signed. On the bus home, I watched the streets pass in the darkening window. Shops, traffic lights, people carrying bags, young mothers pushing prams. I remembered myself at 35, rushing from the bakery to school pickup, thinking that one day life might slow down and someone might take care of me for a change. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the woman in the bus window looked like someone who had believed a very gentle lie. That evening, I sat alone in my flat with the phone on the small table beside my chair. The television was on, but I could not follow it. I kept hearing Helen's phrase, "A proper place for Mum." I thought of the family home I had sold, the money I had given, the years I had arranged my life around everyone else's emergencies. I thought of Arthur, of washing his face when he was too weak to do it himself, of whispering that he was not a burden even when I was exhausted. I had meant it. Love, to me, had never been about convenience. But somewhere along the way, my own need for care had become inconvenient. That was when I realized something I had been avoiding for months. My children no longer saw me as part of their lives. They saw me as responsibility waiting to happen. Tell me honestly, have you ever felt your family speaking about you as a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved? The next morning I woke before 7. Habit more than anything. I made tea, buttered toast, and placed my phone on the kitchen table. Every morning I used to send Helen a little message. Nothing demanding. Hope the children got off all right. Cold today, wrap up. Saw these biscuits and thought of you. Sometimes I called David just to hear his voice, pretending I had a question about the boiler or the bank. That morning, I picked up the phone and opened Helen's name. My thumb hovered over the screen. Then I put it down. I did not feel powerful. I did not feel proud. I felt tired. Tired of reaching. Tired of translating scraps of attention into proof that I still mattered. So I made a decision that looked like nothing from the outside. I stopped calling first. The silence that followed was devastating. The first day, I told myself they were busy. The second day, I told myself not to be childish. By the fourth, I had started carrying the phone from room to room again, pretending I was not waiting. A week passed. No one asked why I had gone quiet. That hurt more than any argument could have. It showed me how much of my place in their lives had been maintained by my own effort. If I did not call, there was no call. If I did not ask, There was no visit. If I did not offer, there was no need to remember me. At first, that emptiness felt like being erased. Then, slowly, it began to feel like a room I could arrange differently. I went to the library on a Wednesday because it was raining and I could not bear another afternoon measuring the silence. I had not belonged to a library for years. The woman at the desk helped me renew my card. She asked what sort of books I liked, and I found I did not know. For so long I had read labels on medicine bottles, school letters, recipes, appointment cards, bank statements. Reading for myself felt almost selfish. In the end, I chose a novel with a blue cover because the sea on it looked calm. I brought it home under my coat so it would not get wet. That afternoon, I sat by the window and read 3 chapters. No one interrupted. No one needed me. At first, the quiet pressed against me. Then I noticed the rain on the glass, the warmth of the mug in my hand, and the strange relief of time that belonged to nobody else. A week later, I saw a notice on the library board for a reading group. I almost walked past it. Then a woman beside me, with silver hair and a red scarf, said, "I've been meaning to try that, but I don't want to go in alone." Her name was Joan. She lived in the same building as me, though we had only nodded in the lift. We went together the following Thursday. There were 8 people in a small room with paper cups of tea and a plate of shortbread. We talked about a book I had barely finished, and nobody seemed to mind when I lost my place or needed a moment to gather my thoughts. They waited. That simple act nearly undid me. It had been so long since anyone had waited for me without impatience. Joan and I began walking together when the weather allowed. Not far. Around the block at first, then to the park, then along the little row of shops where the florist always set buckets of flowers outside. She was a widow too. Her son lived in Leeds, her daughter in Australia. She said things plainly, without pity. "You can be loved and still be lonely," she told me once, as we sat on a bench watching a dog chase pigeons. I thought about that sentence for days. It let me stop pretending that my pain meant my children were monsters. They were not. They were busy, distracted, used to me being there. That was the quieter tragedy. They had mistaken my constancy for something that did not need care. I started using the balcony, small as it was. When I first moved in, I had placed 2 empty pots there and then ignored them. Now I bought compost, parsley, lavender, and a pot of yellow pansies. The man at the garden centre asked if I needed help carrying the bag. I said yes, and did not apologise. At home I worked slowly, sitting on a low stool, soil under my nails, my back aching in a familiar, honest way. The balcony faced the car park, not some beautiful view, but when the lavender caught the afternoon sun, I felt a kind of tenderness for that little space. It had waited for me to stop waiting for everyone else. Months passed before my children began to notice. Helen rang one afternoon while I was at the reading group. My phone was on silent in my handbag. I saw the missed call later as Joan and I were walking home. For once I did not call back immediately. I made dinner first, soup, toast, a small apple. Then I rang her. "Mum, where were you?" she asked. Her voice carried worry, but also the faint edge of someone unused to not being answered. "At the library," I said. "Reading group." There was a pause. "Oh, I didn't know you did that." I looked at the steam rising from my bowl. "You didn't ask," I said gently. David noticed when I stopped reminding him about birthdays. I had always been the one to send messages in advance. "It's Helen's anniversary next week. Don't forget Ellie's card. Your dad's sister would have been 80 today." That year I did not remind anyone. Not because I wanted them to fail. I simply wanted to know what would happen if I stopped carrying the calendar of everyone's affections. He rang me 2 days after missing his niece's birthday and said, half laughing, "Mum, you didn't remind me." I said, "No, love, I didn't." He waited for the rest, perhaps an apology. I did not give one. The silence between us was new. Not hostile, just honest. One Sunday afternoon, David arrived without warning. I was in my bedroom, buttoning a green cardigan and trying to decide whether to wear my comfortable shoes or the slightly smarter ones. The community centre had organised a day trip into the countryside. Nothing grand, just a coach ride, a garden visit, tea somewhere with too many scones. When I opened the door, David was standing there with a bag from the corner shop, milk, biscuits, a newspaper. He smiled as if expecting gratitude to open the door wider than I had. "Thought I'd pop in," he said. Then he looked at my coat on the chair. "You off somewhere?" "I am," I said. "The coach leaves in 20 minutes. He stepped inside anyway and put the bag on the counter. "I thought we could have a cup of tea. Maybe I'd fix that shelf you mentioned." I had mentioned the shelf 6 weeks earlier. Once I would have cancelled everything. I would have taken off my cardigan, put the kettle on, found him a screwdriver, thanked him for remembering. That day I looked at the clock and reached for my handbag. "That's kind of you, but I didn't know you were coming. I've already made plans." He laughed awkwardly. "You're busier than we are these days." I smiled as I locked the balcony door and checked my keys. There was no anger in me, only a calm I had not expected to find. "I spent a long time waiting for people to have time for me," I said. "I don't anymore." David looked at me then in a way he had not looked at me for years. Not as a mother placed permanently in the background. Not as a problem, not as a future crisis, not as someone waiting by the phone. For a second, I think he saw a woman with a life he had not been paying attention to. I went on the trip. Joan saved me a seat on the coach. The sky was bright in that pale northern way, and the fields looked washed clean after rain. We visited a garden with gravel paths, benches and roses tied carefully to arches. I walked slowly, and nobody hurried me. We had tea in a room that smelled of old wood and jam. Someone told a story about losing her dentures in a hotel sink, and I laughed so much my eyes watered. It was not a grand happiness. It was smaller than that, and somehow more believable. It was the feeling of being included without having to earn it. After that, Helen began calling more often. At first, her questions were practical. Had I eaten? Did I need shopping? Was I feeling all right? Then one evening she said, "Mum, you've been different lately." I was sitting by the window, a blanket over my knees, the book open in my lap. "Have I?" I asked. "You don't tell me things anymore." I looked at the dark glass and my reflection inside it. "You can ask me things, Helen." She was quiet. I could almost feel her discomfort through the phone. Before, I would have rushed to soothe her. I would have said it did not matter. I would have made myself easy again. Instead, I let the silence sit there. It did not break either of us. A few weeks later, they both came round together. This time they asked first. That mattered. I made tea, but I did not fuss. I put 3 mugs on the table, a packet of biscuits, and sat down before anyone told me to. Helen held her mug with both hands. David looked tired, older than I remembered noticing. She asked, "Mum, are you upset with us?" I looked down at my hands. They were spotted now, the fingers a little bent, the nails short. These hands had kneaded dough, bathed children, lifted Arthur when his legs weakened, carried shopping, folded school uniforms, held birthday cards, cleaned, cooked, comforted. I said, "I'm not trying to punish you. But I won't keep shrinking myself, so nobody has to feel guilty. Helen's eyes filled, though she blinked it back. David rubbed his forehead. He said they had never meant to make me feel unwanted. I believed him. That is what made it hard. Pain inside a family is not always caused by cruelty. Sometimes it is caused by people taking for granted what has always been offered freely. I told them I loved them. I told them that would not change. Then I said, "But I need you to understand something. I am not just the person who helps, reminds, cooks, waits and understands. I am still here, and I need to live like that matters." No one gave a perfect apology. Real life rarely offers the kind of words that fix everything at once. Helen cried a little, quietly. David said he had been overwhelmed and had not realized how much I had pulled back. I listened. I did not list every missed call, every forgotten invitation, every time I had swallowed my hurt so they could remain comfortable. I did not need to. The old me would have tried to make the conversation painless for them. The woman I was becoming allowed it to be uncomfortable, because the truth often is. Things did not become perfect after that. Helen still forgets to reply sometimes. David still makes jokes when he does not know what to say. The grandchildren are kind, but young, and their lives move quickly past mine. But I no longer turn every silence into proof that I am worthless. If they call, I answer when I can. If I am busy, I call later. If I want help, I ask without apologizing 3 times. If they cannot come, I let myself be disappointed without pretending it is nothing. That may sound small. At 82, small changes can be revolutions. I am still their mother. When David smiles with one corner of his mouth, I still see the boy who used to hide behind the sofa when thunder came. When Helen leans over to kiss my cheek, I still feel the little girl who once followed me from room to room, asking questions about everything. Love did not leave me when I stopped chasing them. If anything, it became cleaner, less desperate, less tangled with the fear of being forgotten. I had spent so long believing that a good mother stays available forever. Now I believe a mother is still allowed to have a door, a calendar, a tired body, and a life of her own. Claro, aqui está uma versão em apenas parágrafo, mais sucinta, mantendo o sentido emocional e o CTA no final. My flat feels different now. The walls are still beige. The lift still smells of damp coats when it rains, and the balcony still overlooks the car park. But there are books on my table, lavender by the window, Arthur's photograph beside the lamp, and a walking stick by the door that no longer feels like defeat. Sometimes I tell him about the reading group, about Joan, about David and Helen trying in their imperfect ways, and about how I am learning, late but not too late, to belong to myself. When my granddaughter Ellie came to visit, she put her phone face down and listened as I told her about the bakery, the early mornings, and her father pressing his nose to the glass counter as a boy. That small gesture reminded me that healing does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it is just someone letting an old story finish. Now, on quiet evenings, I sit by the window with a cup of tea, knowing the phone may ring or it may not. But my worth no longer depends on that sound. My children made me feel like a burden, yes. But when I stopped looking for them every day, I found the part of myself I had left behind in all those years of being needed. I did not stop loving them. I stopped abandoning myself to prove that I deserved to be loved. Tell me, when people stop seeing your worth, how do you remember who you are?